All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Today, we're going to look at chemtrails, since we've got some challenges to whether or not chemtrails actually exist, and since it's kind of in the same time period that we're talking about in the book, we're going to check out some good old-fashioned chemtrail conspiracy theory stuff. Now, this article here is from Business Insider, so take it as you will. Over and over again, the military has conducted dangerous biowarfare experiments on Americans. On September 20th, 1950, a U.S. Navy ship just off the coast of San Francisco used a giant hose to spray a cloud of microbes into the air and into the city's famous fog. The military was testing how a biological weapon attack would affect the 800,000 residents of the city. The people of San Francisco had no idea. The Navy continued the test for 7 days, potentially causing at least one death. It was one of the first large-scale biological weapons trials that would be conducted under a germ warfare testing program that went on for 20 years from 1949 to 1969. The goal was to deter the use of biological weapons against the United States and its allies, and to retaliate if deterrence failed. By spraying people with biological weapons, that was how they're going to deter other people from using it. Yes, of course, that makes a lot of sense. The government explained later, the fundamental to the development of a deterrent strategy was the need for a thorough study and analysis of our vulnerability to overt and covert attack by spraying our own citizens. Of the 239 known tests, what about the unknown ones? In that program, San Francisco was notable for two reasons, according to Dr. Leonard Cole, who documented the episode in his book, Clouds of Secrecy, the Army's Germ Warfare Tests Over Populated Areas. Cole, now the director of terror medicine and security program at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School, tells Business Insider that this incident was notable, first because it was really early in the program, but also because of the extraordinary coincidence that took place at Sanford Hospital beginning days after the Army's test had taken place. Hospital staff was basically shocked that there was some new virus that was not in the area. It wasn't until the 1970s that Americans, as Cole wrote in the book, learned that for decades they had been serving as experimental animals for agencies of their government. San Francisco wasn't the first or the last experiment on citizens who hadn't given informed consent. Other experiments involved mind-altering drugs, the LSD, MK Ultra, the syphilis experiments, the Tuskegee experiments. But it was the germ warfare tests that Cole focused on. All these other tests, while terrible, they affected people counted in the hundreds at most, he says. But when you talk about exposing millions of people to potential harm by spreading around certain chemicals or biological agents, the quantitative effect of that is just unbelievable. Every one of the biological and chemical agents the Army used had been challenged by medical reports, he says, despite the Army's contention in public hearings that they'd selected harmless simulants of biological weapons. They're all considered pathogens now, Cole says. Here are some of the other difficult-to-believe germ warfare experiments that occurred during this dark chapter in U.S. history. You really believe they stopped doing this? These tests were documented in Cole's book and verified by Business Insider using congressional reports and archived news articles. from Minneapolis to St. Louis. The military tested how a biological or chemical weapon would spread throughout the country by spraying bacteria as well as various chemical powders, including an especially controversial one called zinc cadmium sulfide. Low-flying airplanes would take off, sometimes near the Canadian border, and they would fly down through the Midwest, dropping their payloads over cities, says Cole. These sprays were tested on the ground too, with machines that would release clouds from city rooftops or intersections to see how they spread. In the book, Cole cites military reports that documented various Minneapolis tests, including one where chemicals spread through a school. Clouds were clearly visible. To prevent suspicion, the military pretended that they were testing a way to mask the whole city in order to protect it. You still believe anything these people say? They told city officials that the test involved efforts to measure ability to lay smoke screens about the city to hide it in case of a nuclear attack, but in fact they were actually testing chemical weapons on you while telling you that they were going to keep you safe. You still believe them? The potential toxicity of that controversial compound zinc cadmium sulfide is debated. One component, cadmium, is highly toxic and can cause cancer. Some reports suggest the possibility that zinc cadmium sulfide could perhaps degrade into cadmium, but a 1997 report from the National Research Council concluded that the Army's secret test did not expose residents of the United States and Canada to chemical levels considered harmful, but they did expose them to harmful chemicals. However, the same report noted that research on the chemical used was sparse, mostly based on very limited animal studies. Because we know just exposure to small amounts of aluminum can increase your chances of getting Alzheimer's and other diseases. These air tests were conducted around the country as part of Operation Large Area Coverage. There was evidence that the powder, after it was released, would be then located a day or two later as far away as 1,200 miles. Cole says there was a sense that you could really blanket the country with a similar agent, a similar chemical agent. I think that's why people call them chemtrails, because they're chemicals that are being sprayed out of planes. Regular condensation trails dissipate rather quickly because they're just ice. In 2012, Lisa Martino Taylor, sociology professor at St. Louis Community College, Merrimack, released a report theorizing that the Army's experiments could be connected to cancer rates in low-income, mostly black neighborhood in the city where zinc cadmium sulfide had been tested. Wouldn't be surprising. She said she was concerned that there could have been a radioactive component to some testing, though she did not have direct evidence for the possibility. Her report, however, prompted both senators from Missouri to write to the Army Secretary demanding answers. The Associated Press noted at the time, while Martino Taylor's suggestions remain purely hypothetical, the human dimension is never mentioned in most Army documents, Cole writes in the book. Instead, there's just a discussion of how well the particulates spread and what they learned about the possibility of biological attacks from them, the biological attacks that they did. Look. 1966, a study of vulnerability of subway passengers in New York City to a covert attack with biological weapons. We don't have to read all that. We already know they sprayed people in New York. Okay. Look. You can read the rest of the article. How much more do I need to read? Biological warfare programs. Here we go. They're spraying people, right? We're not going to read the whole article. What we learned. Military officials were called to testify before Congress in 1977 after information about these biological warfare experiments was revealed. At the time, those officials said that determining just how vulnerable the U.S. was to biological attack required extensive research and development to determine precisely our vulnerability by spraying actual citizens, the efficacy of our protective measures, and the tactical and strategic compatibility of various delivery systems and agents. According to a record of that testimony quoted in Clouds of Secrecy. Cole, too, says it's hard to see these events now from the perspective that people had then. There was a different mindset in the country then, a Cold War mentality. He says, but argues that doesn't justify glossing over the already known potential danger of agents used. So where does the money come from? The money comes from the endless money printer go burr that the government has. That's where the money comes from, right? I mean, geez, look how long this freaking article is. I mean, how many biological attacks has the government done on the country? Okay, we can see here again another article corroborating this. Did the government poison a city inside the Army's secret tests in St. Louis? You can check that article out too. And then this is what I know personally. They've been spraying in New Jersey, just crop dusting the whole state with who knows what since like 1996 every summer. And yet they did get rid of a lot of mosquitoes, but they've literally been, see, it's the ultra low volume spraying. Takes place from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m., right? And then they just spray the entire state, crop dust the entire state with toxic chemicals that no one actually knows what's in them, right? And it's claimed that it's to get rid of mosquitoes, and it might have gotten rid of some of the mosquitoes, but really draining the swamps is what they needed to do to get rid of the mosquitoes. Yeah, but they're never going to drain the swamp, are they? No, they're not. Instead, they're going to spray poor people in the city with cadmium, zinc from airplanes. And then when someone suggests that there's a chemtrail, people are like, well, prove that there's chemtrails. Okay, here we go, right here. They've been doing it since 1950, and they're still doing it today in New Jersey. Even though this article's from 2023, they're still doing it in New Jersey. They're probably doing this in other states too. No one knows what's in it. No one knows what's in the spray. Just like no one knows what's in these planes. If like people are still asking where are they getting the money from, like, are you serious? Where are they getting the money from? The money printer that they print money with. They have like the plates and they just print money. They just print it. That's how money works. The value of money is the fact that you will get shot in the face by the government if you don't use it. There's no other value to it at this point. It's just that you will get shot by the government if you don't use it. And then they say, oh, well, it's $10 can buy a cup of coffee now, so that's how much a cup of coffee is. And then if you don't accept that, you get shot in the face. That's how it works. That's how money works. I mean, where do they get the money from? Where'd the government get the money from, bro? Come on. Come on. Come on. We got to get past that. Wait, where'd the government get the money from? They create the money. All right. Tragedy and Hope. Nuclear Rivalry and the Cold War, 1945 to 1950. We're on page 918 at the top. The abandonment of the United Front approach in 1945 was a gross tactical error which almost totally destroyed the party in the next 15 years. It had been ordered from Moscow through the French communist leader Jacques Duclos and was, like other mistakes from the Kremlin, at the same time, based totally on a totally mistaken conception of what the post war world would be like. This misconception, firmly rooted in the greater misconception of Marxist Leninist doctrine, and assumed that 1. There would be a post war economic depression, 2. That the United States would relapse into isolationism, and 3. That the United States and Europe, especially Britain, would engage in an imperialist rivalry for markets and economic advantages. Just as the new Soviet foreign policy prepared to exploit this anticipated chaos, so the CPUS was reorganized to profit from the same chaos. Instead, it committed suicide. The collapse of the CPUS from 75,000 members with ample funds in 1945 to less than 3,000 members with hardly a dime 15 years later was assisted by the actions of the United States government, the attacks of party members who were leaving it in droves, and the efforts of ex-members, political leaders, and intellectual bellwethers to strike at the CPUS in substitute for their inability to strike at the USSR. Many of these virtuous warriors were fighting for their convictions, but at least an equally large number were fighting for their personal profit or their personal partisan advantage. In this effort to win personal advantage from a worthy struggle, leadership was taken by some of the ex-communists, the FBI, and the House Committee on Un-American Activities. These anti-communists, some of them professionals, tried to demonstrate that the CPUS, by its penetration into the federal government under the New Deal, into labor unions or education, and into entertainment, especially Hollywood, had gravely endangered the nation. On the whole, from the perspectives of decades, these charges concerned with the period before 1945 seemed grossly exaggerated. On the other hand, the making of these charges in the period 1947 to 1955 was very damaging to the country. The influence of communists within or outside government had been slight. It is, for example, almost impossible to find a single motion picture, book, or play which can be identified as having had influence in leading Americans to feel favorably toward a communist system for this country. It is even difficult to find examples of such an effort. On the other hand, it is possible to find examples of books which gave a too favorable impression of the Soviet Union, just as it is possible to find favorable books on any country, including Tibet, Perón's Argentina, Castro's Cuba, or Trujillo's Dominican Republic. Some of these favorable books on the USSR, such as Lord and Lady Passfield's Soviet Communism, A New Civilization, 1935, or Albert Rees Williams' The Soviets, a Book of the Month Club recommendation in 1937, undoubtedly had influence in establishing an unduly favorable picture of Soviet life. But their influence could not in any way compare in strengthening communism in the United States with the influence in that direction exercised by the breakdown of the capitalist laissez-faire economy in 1929 to 1939, or with the failure of the democratic countries to stand up to fascist aggression in Germany, Italy, and Spain in that same decade. Espionage is another matter, but this is more from the nature of espionage than the nature of communism, except for the very significant fact that the ideological appeal of communism to the half-educated makes it possible for the Soviet Union to obtain secrets without financial payment. In general, the nature of espionage is totally ignored by most people, and this ignorance was only increased by the activities of the anti-communist spy agitations of the 1949 to 1954 period. All past history shows that espionage has been generally successful and intelligence has been generally a failure. By this, I mean that no country had much success in keeping secrets. In the 20th century, as in all earlier centuries, but neither has had any other country uh, but neither has any other country had much success in evaluating or interpreting the secrets it obtained. The so-called surprises of history have emerged not because other countries did not have the information, but because they refused to believe it. The date of Hitler's attack on the West in May 1940 had been given to the Netherlands by the German counterintelligence office as soon as it was decided. The Western countries refused to believe it. The same was true of every one of Hitler's surprises. Stalin was given the date of the German attack on the Soviet Union by a number of informants, including the United States Department of State, but he refused to believe. Both the Germans and the Russians had the date of D-Day, but ignored it. The United States had available all the Japanese coded messages, knew that the war was about to begin, and that the Japanese fleet was at least four large carriers. That a Japanese fleet with at least four large carriers was loose and lost in the Pacific, yet Pearl Harbor was a total surprise. Not really. This last point was so hard to believe once the evidence was available that the same groups who were howling about Soviet espionage in 1948 to 1955 were also claiming that President Roosevelt expected and wanted Pearl Harbor. Maybe not the president, but it seems like the military benefits whenever there's an attack, and the military industrial complex, the military manufacturers. Both these beliefs, if they were believed, were based on gigantic ignorance and misconceptions about the nature of intelligence. The whole purpose of secrecy in government should not be to keep information from other states, this is almost impossible, but to make it as difficult as possible for other states to get certain information so that when they do get such restricted information, it will be so intermingled with other information and misinformation that it cannot be evaluated promptly enough to do them much good. Now, this is what I've been talking about the modernization of information, misinformation. I've talked about this in many videos before I read this book. So I'm not getting it from, maybe I traveled to the future and then I went back to the past and I did get it from this book, but no. That was an independent theory that I came up with. So that's what I've been saying. They flood it with so much information that the real information is there, but you have to either know what the real information is beforehand, or you can figure it out through like logic and common sense and reason. But even that is shoddy, right? So the information, all the information is right there in front of us. All the secrets, that's like the whole Freemason thing. The big secret is there is no secret. But in order for you to be able to decipher the information, you have to have a cipher. That's kind of like how, what's it called? Encryption works, right? The information's there, but you can't see the information because you don't have the proper cipher to decipher the information. Let's read that again. The whole purpose of secrecy in government should not be to keep information from other states, this is almost impossible, but to make it as difficult as possible for other states to get certain information so that when they do get such restricted information, it will be so intermingled with other information and misinformation that it cannot be evaluated promptly enough to do them much good. Any espionage system gets more information than it can handle rapidly. Any country should assume that the enemy has all its own secret information. The lessons of past history fully support this assumption. Following every war, the discovery that is made that the enemy during the war had every other state's most cherished secrets. In fact, the most successful kind of counter-espionage work is achieved not by preventing access to secrets, but by permitting access to information which is not true. This was done most successfully in 1943 in preparing the American invasion of Sicily, which was a surprise to the Germans because they hadn't been provided through their espionage in Spain, or they had been provided through their espionage in Spain with false information about an invasion of the Balkans. The Germans had a somewhat similar success through their Operation North Pole, by which the Germans successfully took over and operated the French underground and the associated British espionage net in a large part of France for about a year. Finally, it is not generally recognized by outsiders that almost all the information gathered by any espionage net is non-secret material fully available to anyone as public information. Even in work against a super secret area like the Soviet Union or in nuclear secrets, this is true. Alan Dulles said that more than 90% of the information which the CIA gathers on the Soviet Union is non-secret. Soviet espionage reports on the United States must contain at least 97% non-secret material. Many, if not most, of the spies and atomic spies apprehended with high-powered publicity by the FBI and the Un-American Activities Committee in 1948 to 1954, to the great alarm of the American people, were not concerned with secrets, while some of them were not engaged in espionage at all, and almost none of them had anything to do with nuclear secrets, contrary to the public releases of the agencies who accused them. So they lie more to us than they lie to other governments. They lie more to their own citizens than to other governments. There was nuclear espionage, and it was successful, but almost nothing was achieved by any spy chasers in the United States either to reveal the culprits or to punish them. Fuchs and Nunn May were real nuclear spies for the Soviet, but others at least equally important are hardly ever mentioned. For example, Frederick Joliot-Curie, the greatest French nuclear physicist, Nobel Prize 1935, and an admitted member of the Communist Party, knew as much about our nuclear work as anyone in Europe, Britain, or Canada. His chief associates fled from France, he did not, in 1940, and worked on the nuclear project in England and Canada until they returned to France after that country's liberation. Some of these associates, notably Hans von Halban and Lou Kaworski and Lou Kaworski, certainly knew as much as Nunn May. This guy's last name is really Nunn May. That's just hilarious. And may have known as much as Fuchs. And the other guy's name is Fuchs. So it's like Nunn May Fuchs. Okay. And unquestionably told all they knew to Joliot-Curie, a communist in 1944. Or again, as an example of numerous unexplored paths by which nuclear information went to Russia, an outstanding Polish nuclear physicist who studied with Joliot-Curie was Ignace Zlotowski. He was in the United States in the critical years during the Soviet race to make the atom bomb as a member of the Polish embassy staff and Poland's representative on the UN Atomic Energy Commission. He sent large quantities of nuclear information behind the Iron Curtain and was present as an observer at the Bikini Bomb test in 1946. Finally, it is evident that a great deal of nuclear information, whether secret or not, is unknown, as well as uranium metal went to the Soviet Union as part of Lend-Lease in 1943. Major George Racy Jordan, USAAF, tried in vain to disrupt these shipments at the time. While most of Jordan's evidence is unreliable, the shipments of uranium to Russia is corroborated from other sources. The significance of such shipments is still unknown, since the export license permitting them was granted at the request of General Groves. Jordan's other evidence, most of which was very discreditable to the New Deal, since he testified that he, Groves, and others were under direct pressure from Harry Hopkins and Vice President Henry Wallace to allow export of nuclear materials, radar, and other secrets to Russia, was subsequently known to be false. Yet all of his statements were given nationwide publicity as by news commentators like Fulton Lewis Jr., by Life magazine, and by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and are still widely believed. Most of the atomic spy cases are similar to this. The earliest of these was the arrest of the Soviet naval lieutenant Redin by the FBI on March 26, 1946, on charges that a Seattle naval engineer, Herbert Kennedy, had sold Redin secrets about the bikini test ship Yellowstone for $250. Damn. This case was a forerunner of others in respect to two false assertions in news releases. One claims by the FBI that information leading to the apprehension of Redin had come from Guzinko atomic spy case in Canada in 1946, and two claims by the HUAC that it had unearthed this significant case. Redin was eventually acquitted when his defense showed that Kennedy had been paid for research he did for Redin in the Seattle Public Library. It's like, so yeah, it's like, it's ridiculous. They're just doing a show. They're like, look, we got some Russians here. You guys hate Russians, don't you? Yeah, look, they're going to get us all. They give us more money so that we can then spray you with biological warfare weapons in order to make sure that the Russians don't do it first. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. Neither Gozinko nor HUAC had anything to do with it. The change in the climate of American opinion, and thus in the attitudes of American juries over 4 years, may be observed in the contrast between the acquittal of Redin in 1946 and the conviction of Abraham Brothman in 1950. The FBI publicity and the universal belief of the American press, both at Brothman's arrest in July 1950 and at his trial in November 1950, was that he was part of a Soviet spy apparatus under a Russian trade organization chief working to ferret out atomic secrets. The New York Times, July 30th, 1950, or that the trial was an atomic spy case. All New York newspaper headlines, November 8th through 23rd, 1950. In fact, Brothman and his secretary, Miss Moskowitz, were the only defendants in a trial for conspiracy to persuade a third person, not on trial, Harry Gold, to commit perjury in July 1947. So it had nothing to do with atomic spies, but every newspaper in America said, oh, they're atomic spies. Undoubtedly, Brothman and his secretary had discussed together what they could do about the testimony to be given by the semi-moronic Gold before a grand jury. Their purpose, in which they clearly failed, was to keep Brothman from being involved in any charges of giving secrets to communists. Technically, they were guilty of conspiracy, were so found, and were sentenced to a total of 9 years imprisonment. In spite of the fact that the trial clearly showed that Brothman had nothing to do with espionage, secrets, or atomic research. The mistaken impression that he did was never removed by the press and remained in the public mind as an established truth, so that the United States Attorney Irving Sapol, who prosecuted this case in November 1950, referred to Brothman as convicted of espionage when he prosecuted the Rosenberg case before the same judge in April 1951. The true story, as far as Brothman was concerned, seemed to be quite different. Brothman was an industrial chemist and chemical inventor who owned a number of chemical laboratories and factories held as subsidiaries of his Pennsylvania Sugar Company. His chief concern was in industrial solvents, in which he held patents on processes and equipment. In 1940, when Brothman was seeking orders for his products, he was approached by a Russian, Jacob Golos, then proprietor of World Tourist, a Communist Front travel agency but previously employed by the Soviet Trade Commission, AMTORG, and its purchasing commission. Brothman offered Golos 10% commission on any orders he could place with either agency for Brothman's products or processes. We now know that Golos was a high official in the Soviet secret police, a major Soviet spy, and one of the three-man control commission of American Communist Party. Brothman knew none of this and was not himself a communist, although in 1940 he regarded the Soviet Union as the chief obstacle to world fascism. For several months in 1940, Brothman gave Golos, both directly and through Golos's mistress, Elizabeth Bentley, blueprints and descriptions of the chemical process he had for sale. All of these were available to any prospective purchaser and had been written up and advertised by Brothman in regular chemical journals, and many were his own inventions. When Brothman objected to talking to Golos or Miss Bentley on the grounds that they knew no chemistry, Golos sent him another agent, a chemist, Harry Gold, who had been doing industrial research, which gradually developed into industrial espionage, for AMTORG for several years. Although Brothman got little or no business from the Russians, he hired Gold as a chemist in one of his laboratories in 1943. 4 years later, after Gold, unknown to Brothman, had become an atomic spy, contact with Fuchs, Brothman discussed with his secretary how Gold's testimony before a grand jury might be given to prevent unfavorable interferences regarding Brothman's contact with Golos in 1940. In view of the changed American attitude towards such Russian contacts from 1940 to 1947, this is not perhaps a surprising reaction, but in the increasingly tense situation of 1950, it won Brothman a 7-year prison sentence for conspiring with his secretary to persuade Gold to commit perjury. Gold was not tried either for the conspiracy or for perjury. The changed atmosphere of American public opinion from 1947 on was greatly intensified by the increasingly strained world conditions and by the growing public knowledge of the nature of the communist movement, its connections with Soviet Russia, and their joint conspiracy against the West. Much of this evidence came from ex-communists such as Elizabeth Bentley, Louis Buttons, Whittaker Chambers, John Lautner, and others. All of these undoubtedly were ex-communists and equally undoubtedly revealed much valuable information about the communist conspiracy and properly roused the American public to the danger of this conspiracy. But it is equally true that the first three names mentioned are known and remembered because they dramatized, distorted, and manipulated
consciously or unconsciously, evidence for their own private purposes. This is particularly true of Elizabeth Bentley and Louis Buttons, both of whom exaggerated their previous roles in the Communist Party, were very ignorant of the real nature and significance of their own evidence or of any evidence, knew very little that was not based on hearsay, often at second or third hand, and undoubtedly embroidered and manipulated their evidence for their private profit. Buttons, who was managing editor, really copy editor, of the communist newspaper The Daily Worker from 1941 to 1945, carefully planned his withdrawal from the party to protect his own interest. His decision was made early in 1945. He arranged for a position on the faculty of Notre Dame University at the end of September, obtained his weekly pay in advance from the Daily Worker for the second week of October, left the paper and the party on October 11th, and joined the Notre Dame faculty 2 days later. In the next 8 years, in addition to his salary, he received gross earnings of $70,000 as a professional ex-communist lecturer and writer. This is certainly legitimate, but it is obvious that Buttons, in order to retain his value in the specialized market, had to continue to produce new evidence, if not new sensations. Much of this evidence, released over the years, became more remote from his personal knowledge or even from the facts. This is, for example, very clear in his efforts to show that American foreign policy in China was controlled, determined, or influenced by persons whom he called communists. Miss Bentley's profiting from her role of ex-communist was much less legitimate, as can be seen from one example. Early in 1950, when Miss Bentley's position was, in money and reputation, precarious, and her 18 months of successful notoriety as an informer seemed to be approaching eclipse, she signed a contract with Devin Adair for an autobiography to be written with the editorial assistance of John Brunini, who would also share in the royalties. At the same time, a libel suit against Miss Bentley by William Remington, whom she had called a communist, had been settled by an out-of-court payment of $9,000 to Remington on Miss Bentley's behalf by the radio network and program sponsor, whom she had made the charges. Basically, like, getting called a communist back then was like getting like Me Too. It was like all you have to do is say, "Oh, I think he's kind of a communist," and then you were done in the media. John Brunini, who was to share the profits of Miss Bentley's book, was foreman of the grand jury which indicted Remington for perjury a few weeks later. Wow. May 1950, for testifying he had not been a communist. The evidence that he was, given before the grand jury headed by Brunini, came from Miss Bentley. Perjury, however, requires two witnesses. Brunini obtained the second witness by browbeating Miss Remington into a statement that her former husband had told her that he paid dues to the Communist Party. To obtain this corroboration from the former Miss Remington, Bernini threatened her with contempt proceedings by making her believe, contrary to the truth, that the privilege against use of wife's evidence did not apply to her after her separation from Remington in January 1947. Damn, he just played her. This disgraceful procedure, which eventually led to Remington's conviction for perjury and to his death in prison by the hand of another prisoner, is indicative of Miss Bentley's attitude towards the truth. To cover up her financial relationship with Brunini, when she was preparing to cooperate with him in the indictment of Remington, the book contract was redrawn, omitting Brunini's name. This was done apparently as a consequence of statements of two employees of Devin Adair who knew of the contract with Brunini's name. One was the woman who typed it. A new contract was drawn which did not contain Bernini's name, and the two employees left Devonadier's employment. The book, published under the title Out of Bondage in 1951, pretended to be Miss Bentley's memoirs, but 2 years later, when an effort was made to use it against her in another judicial proceeding, she called it fiction. In addition to the distorting influence of profit, the story of the communist threat to the United States was also confused and manipulated for partisan motivations. When the wholesale revelations of ex-communists began on 1947, the New Deal and its successor had been in the White House for more than 14 years. The Republicans, especially the congressional delegations, were prepared to do almost anything to destroy the reputation of President Truman and the memory of Franklin Roosevelt in order to win the presidential election of 1948. They were offered a great opportunity to do so when the Republicans won control of both houses of Congress in the congressional elections of 1946. This effort was spearheaded in 1947 and 1948 by the House Committee on Un-American Activities, whose antics over previous years had already shown large-scale disregard of the rules of good procedure, fair treatment, and unbiased investigation. The HUAC in 1947 to 1948 had 9 members, of which the chief were J. Parnell Thomas of New Jersey, Chairman Carl E. Munt of South Dakota, and Richard M. Nixon of California on the Republican side, and 4 Southern Democrats led by John S. Wood of Georgia and John E. Rankin of Mississippi on the Democratic side. The value of the publicity gained by the committee in these 2 years may be judged from the fact that it carried both Munt and Dixon to the Senate in 1948 and 1950, and the latter to the vice presidency and close to the presidency itself in 1952 and 1960. There can be no doubt that the Republican members of the committee realized the value of the publicity to be gained by membership on it, and that their actions were consistently aimed at more partisan advantage for themselves and the discrediting of previous Democratic incumbents in the White House than they were directed to ascertaining the nature and functioning of the communist conspiracy in the United States. So they cared more about getting reelected than actually solving the actual problem. Other legislative committees occasionally copied these tactics. It was this partisan rather than investigatory basis in the behavior of such committees which reduced so much of this investigation of communism into personal vendettas, such as those between Hiss and Chambers, between Remington and Bentley, and between Lattimore and Buttons. In these battles of personalities, charges and countercharges flew about so freely at hearings, in the press, over the airwaves, and occasionally in judicial proceedings that the truth cannot now be ascertained. There can be no doubt that falsehood and even perjury were to be found on both sides. What is equally regrettable is that numerous other accused communists, both in the government and out, whose names were given to these committees on the same basis and sometimes in the same breath as Hiss, Remington, or Lattimore, were almost totally ignored and lost in the personal controversies aroused over these three, largely because of the partisan handling of the investigatory committees. These revelations began in January and February 1947 when Buttons identified Gerhard Eisler as a communist leader in the United States. Within a few weeks, President Truman gave the investigators a prime weapon when he issued the order on March 21, 1947, requiring a loyalty oath from all government workers. The significance of this was that any communist in the government could be prosecuted for perjury unless they had admitted the fact. In the course of the summer, the FBI arrested a half-dozen individuals at various times and announced that they had stolen vital atomic bomb secrets from the heart of the atomic bomb project at Los Alamos. This alarming news was reinforced by a number of press releases from the HUAC. When the accused were brought to trial, however, it developed that they had been guilty of insignificant and technical infractions of the law, such as taking snapshots of each other while serving as soldiers at Los Alamos or pilfering of government property there. Eventually, two were given suspended sentences. One was sentenced to 18 months, a 4 month a fourth got 6 months, and a fifth paid a fine of $250. The original charges of atomic espionage were in headlines. The final disposition of the cases, if recorded at all, appeared as insignificant items on a back page unconnected with atomic espionage. So basically, McCarthyism was a bunch of BS. In February 1948, Representative Thomas, chairman of the HUAC, was seeking from the Congress the largest appropriations his committee had ever obtained. Apparently, to bolster this request, on the last day of the month, from his hospital bed, he issued a 6-page report on Dr. Edward U. Condon, director of the National Bureau of Standards. Condon, one of the world's great authorities on quantum mechanics, had been attacked by Thomas for about a year, chiefly in press releases and in 2 articles in national magazines, apparently because of animosity over Condon's opposition to the Johnson-Mays bill for atomic energy control. The report of February 1948 said flatly, Dr. Condon is one of the weakest links in our atomic security. This charge was based on a mishmash of falsehoods, irrelevancies, and incorrect inferences. It was charged that Condon had obtained his job from the favor of Henry Wallace, then Secretary of Commerce, with the implication that Condon must be a left-winger if Wallace was. In fact, Wallace did not even know Condon and appointed him only for the administrative reason that the Bureau of Standards was part of the Commerce Department. Or again, the House on Un-American Activities Committee report quoted from a letter of J. Edgar Hoover to W. Averell Harriman when the latter was Secretary of Commerce in May 1947. This letter had been stolen from the FBI's loyalty report on Condon and was merely a history of unevaluated reports of Condon's actions as reported to the FBI. As published in the HUAC report, it was edited to cut out, without any indication, sentences favorable to Condon. It was charged that Condon's passport was taken up by the State Department when he planned to go to Russia in 1946. The fact was that this plan was a government-sponsored project to fly about 24 American scientists to Russia in an Army plane, and Condon's participation was canceled by the Army because it regarded him as too valuable a nuclear physicist to be risked behind the Iron Curtain, where he might be kidnapped. The HUAC report said that Condon recruited members to join an organization listed as subversive by the Attorney General, the American Soviet Science Society. It later developed that this organization, which existed for the purpose of translating scientific reports from Russian to English using funds from the Rockefeller Foundation, had never been listed as subversive by the Attorney General, but on the contrary had been encouraged by the United States government as a method of finding out what the Russians were doing in science. But the public doesn't know that. All they have to do is say, hey, it said Russian. it said Russian. And so he needs to go to jail now because he's a communist. And people just believe that. It's like, geez. Okay. The HUAC had simply confused this society with an entirely different organization which the Attorney General had listed. Yeah, they just confused it. Everything's a mistake. They're just so dumb. On this kind of evidence, the HUAC demanded Condon's removal from the government and ominously reported that the situation as regards to Dr. Condon is not an isolated one. There are other government officials in strategic positions who are playing Stalin's game to the detriment of the United States. Condon's repeated request for an opportunity to appear before the committee to refute its charges under oath were ignored. Yeah, you can't say you're not guilty. That's one thing you can't say. The committee, especially its chairman, continued to harass Condon so that it was impossible for him to do his work in the Bureau of Standards. This was done by subjecting him to one loyalty investigation after another. Each takes a great deal of work by the FBI and the accused and requires months. These investigations, one after another, cleared Dr. Condon, but each clearance was followed by new charges and a new investigation. After the fourth clearance and the opening of a fifth investigation, Condon resigned from the government in 1954. So that's like some serious lawfare where they just keep bringing you into court until you give up. You either run out of money or you just realize they're never going to stop. This fifth investigation was demanded by Vice President Nixon, who seems to have felt that his original participation in the unjustified smearing of Condon 6 years before had to be sustained by continued persecution. By that time, Chairman Thomas, who was the director of this persecution in 1947 to 1949, had been sent to prison as a common criminal for making the employees in his congressional office, paid from government funds, secretly give back substantial parts of their salary to him. Wow. Thomas should have restricted his efforts for additional money to smearing innocent scientists in paid articles in national magazines. Yeah. The Condon case was still in its early, fully. Wait, sorry. The Condon case was still in its early full publicity in July and August of 1948 when the Thomas Committee hit the headlines for weeks, day after day, with the testimony of Louis Buttons, Elizabeth Bentley, Whittaker Chambers, and other experts on communists. They listed several dozen names of communists in government in the 1930s, organized in formal groups or cells, and generally paying dues and sending information through couriers like Miss Bentley. Most of those named ignored the charges or simply made a denial to the press, but a few, such as Hiss, who sought to refute the charges, were met by new ones. Eventually, as we have seen, Remington and Hiss were both jailed for perjury, the former for denying that he had been a communist, and the latter for denying that he gave government documents to Chambers. Both cases required 2 trials before convictions were obtained. That's how you know it's bad. When the first trial doesn't work and then they just bring you back in for a second trial, you know the second trial is not going to be fair. Others of these named were called before the committee and refused to give evidence under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which protects against self-incrimination. Little was done about these, but it is clear that many of them were in fact communist and that Bentley and Chambers knew them as such by hearsay at least. Bentley's original evidence in 1948 gave a score of names of communists she had known in the government. More than 2 years passed before it became clear that she did not know any of them at all, had never met them, and could not identify them by sight but had merely gathered their names from her contacts with a few communists who reported directly to her and whom she still knew well. Similarly, she indicated in her original evidence that she broke with the communists and went to the FBI for patriotic reasons in August 1945. Only in 1953, when the Eisenhower administration was still trying to make a major issue of the communists in the New Deal, did Attorney General Brownell, in publishing a letter of J. Edgar Hoover, inadvertently reveal that Miss Bentley's revelations to it did not begin until November 8th, 1945, the day after the newspapers revealed that Buttons had been giving names. Miss Bentley's earlier visits to the FBI in New Haven in August 1945 had nothing to do with her desire to give information or with communists, but was simply her desire to find out if a man who had dated her was an employee of the FBI. Wow. I kind of need to see a picture of this chick. She's got like a lot of dudes. The most sensational evidence from the HUAC was released in the late summer of 1948, just in time to influence the presidential election in November. Apparently, it did not have the influence expected, since Truman was elected. The controversy from its revelations continued for years, and the charges both from the HUAC and from other sources increased in violence. Few of the revelations after 1948 were ever sustained in court. For example, two separate atomic espionage cases involving Clarence F. Hiskey at Aragon Laboratory in Chicago and Joseph W. Weinberg at Berkeley Radiation Laboratory were played up by the HUAC in 1949. Eventually, Hiskey refused to answer questions before the HUAC, was prosecuted for contempt, and was acquitted in 1951. Weinberg, accused by the HUAC of giving atomic secrets to a well-known communist, Stephen Nelson, eventually was prosecuted for perjury at the committee's insistence and was acquitted in 1953. Both scientists found their careers injured by the committee's charges. There were many similar cases. The revelation of communist influence in the United States was undoubtedly valuable, but the cost and damage to the reputations of innocent persons and the total confusion of the American people was a very high and largely unnecessary cost. Eventually, some agencies of the government, such as the Bureau of Standards, the Army, and above all, the State Department, were severely injured by loss of morale, disruption of work, and refusal of valuable personnel to work for the government under such conditions. Much of this damage came from the efforts of Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, Republican of Wisconsin, to prove that the State Department and the Army were widely infiltrated with communists, and from the efforts of neo-isolationists and the China lobby to demonstrate that the Mao conquest of China was entirely due to the treasonable acts of communists and fellow travelers in the State Department and the White House. McCarthy was not a conservative, still less a reactionary. He was a fragment of elemental force, a throwback to primeval chaos. He was the enemy of all order and of all authority, with no respect or even understanding for principles, laws, regulations, or rules. As such, he had nothing to do with rationality or generality. Concepts, logic, distinctions of categories were completely outside of his world. It is, for example, perfectly clear that he did not have any idea of what a communist was, still less of communism itself, and he did not care. This was simply a term he used in his game of personal power. Most of the terms which have been applied to him, such as truculent, brutal, ignorant, sadistic, foul mouthed, brash, are quite correct, but not in quite the sense that his enemies applied them, because they assumed that these qualities and distinctions had meaning in his world as they did in their own. They did not, because his behavior was all an act. The things he did to gain the experience he wanted, that is, the feeling of power, of creating fear, of destroying the rules, and of winning attention and admiration for doing so. His act was that of Peck's bad boy, but on a colossal scale, as the total rejection of everything he had come from in his first 20 years of life. He sought fame and acclaim by showing an admiring world of schoolmates what a tough guy he was, defying all the rules, even the rules of decency and ordinary civilized behavior. But like the bad boy of the schoolyard, he had no conception of time or anything established, and once he had found his act, it was necessary to demonstrate it every day. His thirst for power, the power of mass acclaim and of publicity, reached the public scene at the same moment as television, and he was the first to realize what could be done by using the new instrument for reaching millions. His thirst for power was insatiable because, like hunger, it was a daily need. It had nothing to do with the power of authority or regulated discipline, but the personal power of a sadist. All his destructive instincts were against anything established: the wealthy, the educated, the well mannered, the rules of the Senate, the American party system, the rules of fair play. As such, he had no conception of the truth or the distinction between it and falsehood, just as he had no conception of yesterday, today, tomorrow as distinct entities. He simply said whatever would satisfy momentarily his yearning to be the center of the stage, surrounded by admiring, fearful, shocked, and amazed people. He did not even care if their reaction was admiration, fear, shock, or amazement, and he did not care if they, as persons, had the same reaction or a different one the next day or even a moment later. He was exactly like an actor in a drama, one in which he made the script as he went along, full of falsehoods and inconsistencies, and he was genuinely surprised and hurt if a person whom he had abused and insulted for hours at a hearing did not walk out with him to a bar or even to a dinner the moment the hearing session was over. He knew it was an act. He expected you to know it was an act. There really was no hypocrisy about it. No cynicism, no falsehood, as far as he was concerned, because he was convinced that this was the way the world was. Everyone, he was convinced, had a racket. This just happened to be his, and he expected people to realize this and to understand it. Of course, to the observant outsider who did not share his total amorality, it was all false, invented as he went along, and constantly changed. Everything substantiated by documents pulled from his bulging briefcase and waved about too rapidly to be read. Most of these documents had nothing to do with what he was saying. Mostly he had never looked at them. They were merely props for the performance, and, to him, it was as silly for his audience to accept such documents to be relevant as it would be for the audience in a theater to accept food that is being eaten, the whiskey that is being drunk, or the documents which are being read in that play to be relevant to what the actor is saying. Like any actor who might be charged with inconsistency or with lying because what he says in one play is not compatible with what he says in another play, McCarthy was puzzled, offended, hurt, or amused. With him, every day, every hour was a different play. As a result, To the audience, nothing was consistent with anything else. He gave several different dates for his birth, and after 1945, never the correct one, November 14th, 1908. Every time he spoke or wrote of his war experiences, the story was a different one, and with each version he became larger, more nonchalant hero. Eventually in 1952, when his power in Washington was at its height, and most of the government feared to draw his wrath or even his attention, he intimidated the Air Force into awarding him the Distinguished Flying Cross given for 25 combat missions, although he had been a grounded intelligence officer who took occasional rides in planes. Since laws and regulations were, for McCarthy, non-existent, his businesses and financial affairs are, like his life, a chaos of illegalities. From 1935 to 1942, his gross income was less than $25,000, yet during the 7 years, he put more than twice that into the stock market. When he was elected judge in 1939, one of his earliest decisions was appealed by the state to its Supreme Court, where it was found that McCarthy had destroyed those portions of the record in which he had justified dismissing the state's complaints. Shortly after he arrived in Washington as a new senator in 1947, he heard of Pepsi Cola's difficulties with sugar rationing, accepted a $10,000 unsecured loan from Pepsi Cola's lobbyist, and the next day opened an attack on sugar rationing. When this attack was successful, the same lobbyist endorsed a note for $20,000, which McCarthy used to cover his overextended bank account in Wisconsin. A year later, as the most active member of a joint congressional committee on housing, he gutted the public housing features out of the Taft Ellender Wagner housing bill in return for thousands of dollars in favors from the private housing lobby. One of these favors was $10,000 from Lustron Corporation in return for putting his name as author on one of its publicity releases. And so it went. Most of his ill gotten gains being dissipated on horse racing bets, gambling, or parties for his friends. When the Senate Subcommittee on Privileges and Elections late in 1951 began to study one of his bank accounts, it found unexplained deposits of almost $173,000 and others of almost $97,000 funneled through the administrative assistant in his office. Until early 1950, communism meant little to McCarthy. He had been elected to the Senate over the incumbent La Follette in 1946 as a result of the communist controlled votes in the labor unions of Milwaukee. As senator, he collaborated in a joint Nazi and communist plot to injure the United States and its army by reversing the convictions of the German SS troops for atrocities committed on American prisoners of war captured in the Battle of the Bulge. But in January 1950, McCarthy was looking for an issue to be used for his re-election in 1952. At dinner with three men, two of them associates of mine, in the Colony restaurant in Washington, January 7th, 1950, he asked what issue he should use. After several suggestions, he seized upon communism. That's it, he said. The government is full of communists. We can hammer away at them. To obtain an audience for this hammering, he requested bookings for Lincoln's birthday speeches from the Senate Republican Campaign Committee and was given assignments at Wheeling, West Virginia, Salt Lake City, and Reno. Without any real conception of what he was doing and without any research or knowledge of the subject, at Wheeling on February 9th, McCarthy waved a piece of paper, copy of a 4-year letter from Brines to Representative Adolph Sabath, and said, "While I cannot take the time to name all of the men in the State Department who have been named as members of the Communist Party and members of Aspiring, I have here in my hand a list of 205 that were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working in shaping the policy of the State Department." The letter, in fact, named no names, had nothing to do with spying or even with communists, but simply reported that 3,000 employees of established war agencies who were being shifted to the State Department budget had been screened, and 284 had been listed as undesirable, of which 79 had already been separated from service, 26 of these because they were aliens. Every time McCarthy repeated the charge, the numbers and categories changed. For example, the following night, he told his Salt Lake City audience, "Last night, I stated that the names of the 57 card-carrying members of the Communist Party." Out of the controversy raised by these charges emerged McCarthy the Accuser, known to every American and praised or reviled by millions. He loved it. On February 20th, in an incoherent speech of more than 6 hours in the Senate, he announced that he had penetrated Truman's Iron Curtain of secrecy and that he was going to give 81 cases identified by numbers without names. What ensued in the next 6 hours was bedlam, as case after case was presented filled with contradictions and irrelevancies. There were 81 numbers, but only 66 cases. 4 cases were left out. Some were repeated. It said 4 FOR, but I think it's FOUR cases were left out. Some were repeated with different numbers, and many had never been employed by the State Department or even by the government, and one, primarily a morals case, had been discharged from it because he was anti-communist, while another, case 72, was a high type of man, a democratic American who opposed communism. It was, according to the Senate Republican leader, Senator Taft, a perfectly reckless performance. Nevertheless, Taft and his colleagues determined to accept and support these charges since they would injure the American administration. Accordingly, Taft told McCarthy, "If one case doesn't work, try another." The public, informed only of the charges without the cynical details, gathered from the newspaper headlines that the State Department was full of communist spies. Even today, few people realize that McCarthy, in 5 years of accusations, never turned up a communist in the State Department, although undoubtedly there must have been some there. All right, I'm just going to stop reading there. On page 932. If you want to keep reading, the link to the PDF is in the description. So, bro, I mean, we can see right there that the government is full of crap. Basically, people that become politicians are more concerned with getting reelected than they are with actually solving any problem. We can see that clearly. We can see that some of the most highly, quote unquote, respected people in the government, elected officials, have no idea what they're talking about at all. No idea. They will just make up stuff and then say, well, we've got the guys with the guns and you have to do what we say. We'll put you in jail. Completely fabricated, completely made up, complete BS. And then they'll come to you to put you in jail and act like you did something, right? And people are like, what about the chemtrails, bro? Yeah, it's completely verified that the government was dropping viruses and all types of
metallic chemicals on people, you think they stopped because they told you? They're like, oh yeah, we stopped. We totally stopped doing that. We're not going to do COVID again either, right? Yeah. Okay. You keep believing that type of stuff. Okay. So I'm going to get out of here before I get into any more trouble today. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.